Before we go ahead, I'd just like to introduce you to our guest today. Suhail is joining us all the way from Delhi. He's the AVP Growth at Urban Company and is currently leading growth for men's grooming and spa at home categories. And he's also involved in designing the GTM strategies and creative processes for the same. And previous to joining the wonderful team at Urban Company, he has headed key business portfolios across sectors as telecom and travel. And with an experience of over 8 years, he's joining us today to share a few highlights of his career and life. Over to you, Suhail. Would love to hear from you some of the highlights of your life and basically how everything led you to where you are.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ria, for that introduction. So I think some of it Ria has already covered what I'm doing currently at Urban Company. It's essentially taking care of three categories now, which form majority of beauty portfolio. It's men's grooming, which is men's salon services, and spa for women services, as well as massage for men. So fairly interesting. The last 1.5 years, the way they have panned out for our business grew rapidly post-COVID first wave. Then again, COVID wave 2 happened in India, and that really impacted the business for us. But we've bounced back fairly recently, and actually hitting our new highs every month. So every month is, let's say, our ever highest revenue and deliveries that we're doing for Urban Company, as well as the beauty services overall. So before that I spent around 1.5 years with this startup called Travel Triangle, taking care of their domestic marketplace business. Again, fairly interesting and kind of close to my heart sort of business, because being myself interested in travel, wanted to solve for people actually taking organized or let's say a pre-booked travel trips, wherein the solve for a customer is that they don't have to talk to and hassle with multiple travel agents to plan a trip for them, while for the supply side it was again simple to get them and bring them more business. Before that, spent most of my time, working time, I would say, with Ola. Joined them back in 2014 to lead their Delhi NCR business. Ola again was quite small. 2014, I don't think most of you have even heard of Ola cabs back then. This is almost 7 years before, and the business rapidly scaled for us. Because the market evolved, the overall adoption for on-demand cab services and ride-hailing services grew for us. So did that for 2.5 years. Scaled up supply, demand, operations, fulfillment for Delhi, which eventually became and I think it still is our largest city of operations wherever we are present in India. Then moved to Bangalore, a central strategy role, set up their electric vehicle business. So Ola started to get into EV space in 2017, wherein we first launched a very basic small scale EV pilot in Nagpur. We set up our own charging stations, put around 100 odd vehicles, which included both 4-wheelers and 3-wheelers. And that eventually helped us determine the kind of play we want to have in the EV space. So designing that entire part and then ultimately getting into strategy, wherein EV became a key business line for Ola, and hence it spun off into a separate entity. So Ola Electric is a different company altogether, and now getting into manufacturing of Ola scooters, some of the news that you guys would have heard. So Genesis was late in 2017. I left when we had finalized that this is something that we want to do, and now want to set up more like a manufacturing unit. I think quite eventful 4.5 years there. Before that, had a small stint with Airtel, joined them from campus, was doing sales in some of the remotest part of UP. I don't know, I'm sure you would have heard the city, Mirzapur. I was actually doing sales in Mirzapur. So had fairly interesting times there as well for various other reasons, but was a good stint there as well. So I think that in a nutshell what I've been up.
So having worked across all these different sectors, from marketing to supply to now leading growth, what is it like leading growth in a gig marketplace?
I think a couple of important things. One, of course, is that I think we've made growth look like a sort of a separate entity altogether. Typically growth is everything, right? I mean when you are in a startup, everybody is actually focusing for growth, right? A very basic, simple first principle definition is that anything that grows your business, either in terms of consumers or users that you have, or your revenue eventually, right, is growth, right? So when you are in business, again, you are focusing on growth because you want to figure out what new opportunities or new business lines that you can expand into, right? So that's growth. When you're working on product, the very simple thing that you figure out, when you are launching a minimum viable product or some sort of testing, both, in a marketplace, both supply and demand side, is how does it help grow the business, right? And eventually what sort of incremental revenue that it can bring. So that is also growth, right? And growth in traditional terms, what we have come to use in startup ecosystem is growth in terms of consumers, right? So how do you acquire new customers? How do you retain them on the platform? What sort of metrics you look like, from the consumer side that will make you, grow this base is essentially what growth is, right? And hence demand generation marketing falls under the definition of growth. But if you ask me, I would typically say that, everybody who is in an organization and especially in a startup is actually contributing towards growth in some way or the other.
Got it. Since you also talked about the different sides of the marketplace, right? So one side of that marketplace is the partners. So what are the key elements to growing that supply side of the gig marketplace? What is it like?
It depends on the business and industry, but the fundamentals of marketplace are similar, right? Which is why they've come to know. And while again it is a very loosely held term, right? The way marketplace have been traditionally, and they've been evolved a lot since the different businesses and different industries have come up. So for example, again, ride hailing, Ola, Uber is a very classic example of marketplace where you just connect supply to demand, right? And you are a platform that enables that. Urban Company is a marketplace, but it's slightly different, right? And we call ourselves as a full stack or sort of a managed marketplace, wherein we're connecting supply to demand, but we're also ensuring that there is a certain standard of service or quality is being provided by the supply to the consumers. So when it comes to how do you grow or how do you identify or define what your supplier partner base is very fundamental or functional to the kind of business that you're operating in, right? So how do you start off with? Let's say when you think that you are a marketplace, essentially you figure out what is the fundamental consumer user problem that exists, right? And you solve for that. I mean, that's the genesis of a business. You're not there just to connect one supply to a demand, but what that connection is solving for both set of customers, right? Your supply is also your customer, right? So that is essential to figure out. And then you see that what is the target supply pool that you have, right? Who are these people who can become part of your partner or supply pool? And then how can you strategize in growing that base? So to give you an example, for ride hailing companies like Ola and Uber and all other companies for that matter in the industry, right? Didi in China or Grab or Lyft, etc. It's a simple model, right? That a person has to go from point A to point B. Like that's as simple as a problem. That what is the most efficient way to solve for it, right? And the way you figure out is that you provide this user an app wherein they can see the vehicles available, close by to them. They just book in and the car just arrives, right? And then they can be dropped off to B, and both supply and demand interact. They pay to each other, and this platform, by virtue of connecting supply and demand, charges a commission out of it. Right? So it becomes this easy supply pool that all of the people who have, for example, commercial cars in India, right, eventually become your supply pool. But they are the ones who are actually doing the delivery, right? They are the ones who are driving the car and keeping, making people travel from A to B. The owners of these vehicles could be someone else, right? And that becomes your secondary supply pool, right? So I target the ones who are actually doing the end job or business in terms of the supply there. And then I figure out that if I want to grow this base or increase or do something with it, let's say, can I create other business models around the supply pool? And that's how you grow, right? So as a real example, in Ola, of course, we targeted the cab owners or drivers who were there on road and bring them on board, because there is a very easy use case to sell that they have access to, let's say, a regular demand. That's one that solves for him. Secondly, it's a marketplace wherein you have the entire autonomy of logging in, doing work whenever you want to, right? So that's the second biggest proposition that works for all the gig economy platforms. And third, of course, once you get access to demand, hence your earnings and the money that you make increases significantly. And that is the single largest driver, right? So now you take this business and then you overlap the same to any marketplace, and the fundamentals will remain the same, right? So Urban Company, again, the same thing. For example, let's say somebody who wants to provide a haircut at home, right? Now these are the people who probably would have been doing it either at a salon, right, and working there. What is the proposition for them? If you're making X money, you will make X plus 30% when you join the company, right? Because by virtue of the access of demand that you're getting, that's one. Second is you're able to manage your time the way you want to, right? I mean, It's not like that you have to go to your salon where you're working every day at 10 a.m. and leave by 8 p.m., right? You can work for 6 hours a day, you can work for 12 hours a day, however you want to, right? So it depends on how much money you want to make, etc. So fundamentals remain the same. Your earnings increase, you have the autonomy, right? The supply pool typically is available from the first set are people who already do this work in an offline market, because none of these are industries that have been created from scratch, right? People were still traveling from going from home to airport, right? They were maybe they're using likes of Merus, etc., or some car guy whom they used to call. They used to have some phone numbers on their mobile and just call them, right? Similarly for haircut, right? Or let's say for people who want to take an AC repair in urban company, or people who want to, let's say, take a spa services, right? These markets or business already exist in the offline world, right? What you typically do is solve for the fundamental problem for both set of customers, right? Not just your consumers, but your partners as well.
Got it. And has the pandemic in any way had any impact on this, on the supply side?
Yeah, of course. In all of the businesses, some businesses got impacted much significantly in terms of the downside that happened, right? Again, ride hailing is one example. Practically, there is no commute happening, right? So you have lockdowns, people can't go from place A to B, offices were shut down, etc., right? So what happens that and a lot of people, and especially these gig economy workers, they went back to their hometowns, right? A lot of them, most of them are actually immigrants coming to the metro cities or tier 2 cities from the smaller towns nearby to work, right? And they had to go back because the business was shut down. And these are the people who typically don't also have a lot of savings. They don't have like sort of a runway where they can even sustain for another 3 months or 6 months, right? So they live from on a month-on-month basis. So a lot of these people went back, right? And when the supply is already out of your centers where you want to run, right? Again, getting them back is not an easy thing, right? So you have to figure out, give sort of assurance that they would be getting work. Of course they do need work, everybody, because they're practically, even when they are back to their villages or hometowns, they're out of work mostly, right? So hardly 10-15% of them stay back, do something where they are living and don't come back. But a lot of the supply pool is actually eager to come back, right? Again, a very real example, one company for our spa services, there's a significant chunk of supply pool which is based out of northeastern states, right? And they are staying in Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, these large metros, and they went back, right, when COVID happened, even in this wave. But they also know that as an organization, you are very transparent and take care of your supply and partners in general, right? So which have this sort of trust in them, and of course because they want to ultimately make money, and so they want to come back. And now mostly all of them are back to their bases and have started working.
Got it. Yeah, it's fundamentally true. I mean, getting the supply pool in place is definitely not an easy task, especially when you have a flux of people coming in from across the country, not just from one part of the country. So yeah, one side of the marketplace, the other side of the marketplace, I mean, is also the consumers, right? And you lead the GTM strategies and the creative processes over there. So in this 1 year of working at Urban Company, so are you seeing any framework evolving for this side of the marketplace as well?
So there are two sets of frameworks that typically work, right? One are your, the traditional marketing that you look at, right? How do you grow consumer base, and the sort of, brand funnel or metrics that you track, right? So, and that has been there for years, right? And FMCGs have been leading the way in terms of for the individual brands that they find out, right? So those sort of things remain the same. So, if you have, let's say, a product or a service, what sort of awareness levels you have, in the target segment that you want to be present in, right? You check that, right? You do a lot of quantitative surveys, you reach out and talk to a lot of consumers and qualitatively figure out that, in generally, are they aware about what you're providing, right? What sort of things they say. And then you go further down the funnel, you realize that, even people who are aware, do they consider you, right? I mean, they might be aware, but they think, okay, I know about you, but maybe, I never thought about using you, for example, I don't consider. And the third side is they still consider you. You are one of their 2-3 options to go to, right? But they still don't find you relevant for their use cases. They say that, hey, by the way, I heard of you, maybe I need a salon service, but I don't think I need a salon service at home because maybe I don't have space, or I don't trust the quality, and maybe I'll just go to my salon which is near to my house and do that. So, that is one sort of fundamental things, that how do you break, all of these steps down, right? How do, if you realize that awareness is a problem, that people are not even aware about your services, but those who are aware, are very highly likely to try you out, right? So then your task become very easy on the consumer side. Then you just have to create awareness. You just have to then figure out, your GTM or your strategies to, build awareness on these users. But you realize that, let's say, for example, there is a good chunk of your target segment that is aware about you, but still don't find you relevant, or they don't still consider you as their preferred choice of product or a service provider, then probably you have to solve for that, right? And then the strategies change, right? So then your GTM plan or the things that you do is not the same which you do, let's say, when you want to create an awareness. So that's one part. Second is something which is slightly more specific to a lot of now tech and these app-based B2C organizations, because what it does is that it gives you a very rich and a lot of information and data about the consumers that you already have, right? So if the task is to figure out how do I grow my business in terms of getting more new customers, right? I already have a lot of rich information about the customer that I already have on the platform, right? And that helps a lot. And I think one of the things which growth leaders or generally whoever is looking at, even at a growing startup or let's say somebody or a company that already has a good user base, is to very granularly analyze and assess this data that you have, right? This is like a gold mine that you're sitting on. I have the entire app journeys of the customers that come onto the platform. I don't know, I know when and when not people transact, what time, what are the occasions that they come and transact on, what makes them drop off from the app, right? How much time do they spend on the app, for example, right? So all of these different journeys that could be created, and you can also break it down in terms of the user cohorts, right? So this whole rich repository, etc., of data that's available is an added on top of what you want to do generally, which is true for any organization building its user base and making them repeat and use more, and you add or complement it with the rich set of data that you have. So yeah, those are the things that typically form the major frameworks for our group.
Got it. And what's the difference between growing an early stage startup versus a later stage gig marketplace?
2-3 things. One very critical initially thing is to get to a fundamental product market fit for both the supply and the demand side, right? I think one of the things we typically end up missing is when we talk about and we look at the product market fit, it essentially boils down only to your end consumers, right? And not so for your supply, right? Supply is like, because it's much more quantitative, easy. Once you realize that, for example, this is my business, this is my supply pool. And what has happened in typically startup ecosystem is that because you can fund your losses in a way, right? And that essentially is the right term, that you fund your losses, and then you can typically build up your supply pool much easily in the initial phase, right? But sustaining them and then hence growing your business basis, that becomes difficult, because if that is your only fundamental way of onboarding or getting supply, right? The PM fit has to be very strong for both supply and the demand, and hence your early adopters are the ones who are your key advocates for the business, right? So if you bifurcate between, let's say, an early stage startup, what you are trying to solve for is you're trying to solve for your first, let's say, 10,000, 15,000 customers, right? You're trying to solve for your first 1,000, 2,000 partners, right, which are there on the supply side, and that's where you create your entire offering and product around them, right? So that's the fundamental. When you're, let's say, comparatively a larger setup, right, and the definition could be very different. The definition could be, let's say, the user base that you have, or let's say the sort of revenue that you have, depends on industry, right? But when you cross a certain scale, right, then you're crossing a certain scale because you figured out that there is a fundamental PM fit that has been established, right? So then you have to figure out what you need to do with the set of assets you have created in a marketplace. And in a marketplace, your assets are always your customers, right? Because you don't own any physical asset, right? Your consumers and your supply pool and partners are your assets. How can you leverage that, right? So can I create some adjacencies, right? Can I figure out that there are some other business lines or other adjacent businesses that could be formed with, let's say, the same set of consumers, or even, let's say, for the same set of supply. Just to give an example, both Ola and Uber, of course, started off with this ride sharing services, which was pool and share services, right? Now the genesis was very very simple. It happened, and it started off in Delhi only when the odd even rule happened. So we realized that there is a huge influx of demand coming in because people can't really take their own vehicles, but our supply is limited, right? So how do you solve for it, right? You basically make more than 1% share a single cab ride, right? So practically you have multiplied the supply without actually physically increasing the supply, right? Now you start off with that idea, but you can do it only at scale, right? You can't do it at small scale. Why? Because marketplaces typically, and especially hyperlocal marketplaces, work very specifically on the network effect, right? So the more supply you have, the more demand you have, the more demand you have, the more supply you have, right? So when you are at a small scale, the demand and supply is so scattered that the ride sharing can only work in where there are people living in vicinity, right? So that the cab cannot deviate much and can go from point A to point B, which is the first customer's pick up and drop point, right? That can only happen where there is very high concentrated demand in one place and also a concentration of supply in one place, right? And that only happens at scale, right? So that is the difference, right? So you figure out your fundamental basic product, you figure out your PM fit in the initial phases for both supply and demand. And as you scale up, you find out more opportunities to grow your business from there.
Yeah, and does this difference that you mentioned, does it scale or evolve further as you scale across geography, or does it remain the same?
So it is different. I mean, not much so for, let's say, at geography level. There could be nuances again basis the specific industry, right? And one thing which we have to keep in mind while keeping all of this thing is the fundamental user or consumer behavior doesn't change, right? So when you say that, let's say either you're a marketplace or you're an X business or a Y business, right? These are all good. For example, I say fancy terms to use in the ecosystem, but the fundamental way a consumer behaves doesn't change, right? So for again, there could be geographical differences and nuances, right? Which essentially comes from, let's say, people in Chennai can behave very differently, from let's say, people in Delhi, right? Now that is true, that has been there for a while, right? You can't change that fundamental truth, right? So you typically adopt your business according to that, if your business is affected by those kind of things. So for example, again, we take urban companies example. What we are essentially now doing is completely, or let's say 50-60% of our offerings in beauty services will be very different what they are in Chennai than what they will be in Delhi, right? Because way consumers traditionally have been adopting beauty products or using beauty products.
Also, what's your take on the Indian gig economy? Like, how has it evolved in the past decade, and what is the trend going forward? What's your outlook on that?
I think it's 2-3 things that have changed. One, of course, is the overall ecosystem has evolved a lot, right? I mean, we've seen a lot of influx of new age and startups coming in, right? Practically trying to solve 2-3 things. One, of course, is either making something which has been done offline traditionally to make it online, right? Something that could be solved for in terms of within the same vertical, finding those niches out and then solving for it, right? And some of them, have been trying to transform the industry, but has been broadly, figuring out how do you make life easier for the consumers in general, right? So for example, this whole industry around fresh meats, right? I mean, again, the likes of Licious, Fresh to Home have been existing for a while, right? But they haven't, what they're practically solving for is that, it's a huge market, huge opportunity. You just multiply the consumption by the number of users, out there. And then what you solve for is typically making them accessible and available to people who really don't have them in their vicinity, or maybe reducing lead times to get there. And they build the entire business on top of that, right? So the way it has evolved is all of these first, you already only start off with the larger opportunities, right? I mean, traditional e-com with the product business, then you get into specific verticals of, let's say, apparels, etc. They're becoming big enough, right? When you got into transportation, fintech services, all of these things, the way they, grow from here is, you grow narrower and narrower. You pick those niches, and then typically, you grow their business, because frankly speaking, there are not a lot of fundamental problems to be solved for at a larger use case. There is right now not a lot of D2C or other brands that would be talking to your 50 million, 70 million user base, right? I mean, anybody who has a 2 to 3 million user base, anyway, can turn itself into a unicorn. So the way things have been defined is that you go more narrower into niche, get to a certain scale, and then figure out your path from there.
Got it. All right. So we also have a couple of questions on the chat box. So before we move on to that, I just have one more question. You have shared a couple of experiences like across all the sectors that you've worked in, be it in Ola or like travel company or the travel company that you have mentioned. How do the dots connect for you, and basically any advice that you have for all the growth practitioners out there?
Well, I think for me personally, it has been that, marketplace as an overall model, I would say has worked so, well so far for India, and been fortunate to work with, companies or startups that are in that space, right? My interest typically has been in figuring out where the business opportunities are, right? And then find them, work, and then grow. So for example, again, one of the things that we're looking at urban companies now to expand its international footprint, right? So working on figuring out how can we unlock or launch, let's say, next 6 or 10 odd countries, right? So it goes on into different stages. At a smaller scale or a smaller startup, you figure out your basic business model and how do you grow from there, right? Where are your next 100,000, 200,000, 1 million customers are coming from? When you are already at a place where you have acquired that many users, you figure out that, hey, how do you go deeper into the categories that you are existing in, right? And also if there are opportunities to expand horizontally, either in terms of geographies or in terms of services, especially for companies that give you that leeway, right? So for example, urban company has an advantage that all of the categories that are there on the platform has only one common binding thing, that you can get it done at home, right? But they're fundamentally very different, right? Your professional home cleaning is very different in terms of use case compared to, let's say, a salon service, right? Which is very different use case from, let's say, getting your refrigerator repaired. So all of these are different categories. What it gives you an advantage is that you can continue to find newer opportunities in terms of businesses and grow. So that's how I have also defined my journey, that you start off with very one niche, or I won't say niche, but let's say one specific business which was into transportation, then figuring out expansion opportunities, and now figuring out new categories altogether within the ecosystem of at-home services. So that's for me. I think it's a different sort of motivation or path for everyone, right? So for growth practitioners, 2-3 things which again are very fundamental and will remain the way they are, no matter which industry business you are, is being very, very close to the consumer, right? When you're leading growth, what you are essentially solving for getting your next set of customers onto the platform, right? Getting your next set of customers or your existing customers to repeat more, right? So these things become important and are very critical when you know who your consumer is, right? I mean, spend time being as close as possible to the ground, right? So I think that's one big thing. The second critical part is how do you figure out that what can be scaled with the product that you have, right? So you start off with a very small business, right? You scale that up, right? You don't have to always figure out that how do you operationally solve for it with people coming in, right? So product has to be at the core of it. This is why a lot of these tech companies are existing, right? They're solving the core of it with the help of a product. So that becomes important.
The first question that, of course, comes to my mind is that globally there are, of course, other big players, right? There are TaskRabbit, etc., right? So do you think, or do you observe any fundamental operating differences between a global, gig economy marketplace versus urban clubs or Olas, etc., which are born out of India?
Yeah, I think one very key fundamental difference is that is a departure which even urban company has taken over the last 3 years, is moving away from, let's say, a pure play marketplace, and which is why I use this term of managed full stack marketplace. Is before 2018, the way urban company was operating is similar to what a lot of companies are operating. Like have TaskRabbit, there are other organizations even in the Middle East, etc., that are doing the way earlier it was. It's a pure play marketplace where you have a supply which you get onboarded, with basic checks and balances, and you just connected with the consumers, right? And you're out of the way. So once it's more like a lead generation model, right? Which even these companies in the West are operating at, wherein you connect consumers to the supply and your job is done, right? What it fundamentally breaks is the whole experience part of it, right? Both for the supply as well as customers, right? The beauty in running a marketplace lies in solving a complex problem and also standardizing it. So the way now urban company functions and the way it's different from any other task management or I would say at-home service marketplace is that we own the entire customer experience, right? So which means that services which require products are being used by the supplier or by the by these partners who have to purchase or buy them from urban company. So for example, if let's say you're taking again a massage or a spa service, right? The partners can't use their own oil, right? It's the same oil that is being used by everyone across India, right? And they have to buy them from the company. So A, that standardizes the product. B, they have to undergo through this entire SOP training part of it, right? So the NPS is the single North Star critical metric that we chase. So if the business, which is A, has a lower NPS, or if the business or if the NPS is going down, despite the revenues and the top line increasing, is a business which is we would something we would say that's not a feasible business for us, right? Again, a very real example, let's say, is a painting business, very complex, very difficult to execute, right? And hasn't been a great NPS business for us, right? So which is why conscious call has been taking that, we're not expanding the scale of business, right? But rather we are focusing on solving for NPS first, right? And figuring out what needs to be done both at the supply side primarily as well as on the product side to solve for it. So yeah, I think that's a fundamental difference, that you own this entire piece yourself.
This question is also again on the gig economy. So when you mentioned about how Urban Company is a full stack company, and you provide services to your marketplaces, and more effort is done on the execution part of it. So how would a managed marketplace model, just like Urban Companies, would be significant in these gig economies? What factors would those play, and what role, and how would that be important?
Interesting question. So I think there are two aspects of it, right? And again, stark difference. And I've been fortunate enough to look at two different marketplaces. One in Ola, for example, which is completely a definition of pure play marketplace. You just connect supply demand, and you practically are not doing a lot. You do check on quality, etc., but not to that extent. Versus, let's say, a managed, wherein you are going full stack, right? So the difference, or rather I would say, why a managed marketplace is important, is because the customer experience has to be at the core of whatever business you are in, right? If that experience goes for a toss, and this is why I deliberately use the word customer experience, not consumer, because customer is both your supply and demand, right? So both the experiences have to be top notch for the business to then multiply, right? Otherwise, what you end up doing is that you end up funding either your demand or either your supply, right? And what I mean by that is that, for example, a lot of these companies have a minimum business guarantee of sorts, wherein you are paying supply or your partner a certain amount of money, even if they are not getting any demand, right? Just to make sure that they are on your platform, right? Similarly, you're funding a lot of discounts to customers, right? Just to try your services or maybe repeat, right? But that is not scalable. That can only happen because you're funding them, from the VC money that you're getting. But for, let's say, businesses to scale, or for your brand to be loved, right, it has to be adopted really well by both set of customers, right? And that can only happen when you're providing a top-notch experience, right? So all of these attempts, which a lot of companies do to manage marketplace, is three set of investments, right? One primarily on the supply side only, one is on standardizing the SOPs, for example, right? Focusing a lot more on the training part of it, right? And practically you can train any sort of these gig economy workers, because most of them come from that background where, even if they are very good at the hard tasks that they do, right? The soft skills are something that gets missed, but are being valued by consumers a lot, right? So the proper training, creating the standardized SOPs, and then managing the entire customer experience and breaking that down into what all can break and what all can you own in this entire piece is something that becomes critical. And now a lot of companies are going beyond that, right? So a lot of marketplaces have been traditionally, when they go from, let's say, there's 0 to 1, 0 to 10 or 0 to 50 kind of a journey, is where the supply pool already exists for them, right? These are the people who have been anywhere working in the industry or business. Offline, you just have to bring them online with the basic quality checks. But what if you have to grow further from there, because you are seeing a lot of demand, right? So you create the supply, right? The way, for example, ride-hailing companies created the supply pool, where we enabled people to buy their own commercial cars, right? So if you are driving for somebody else, you can buy your own car. If you have one car or one cab, the company assists you to buy second one, and let's say put another cab driver for that, and becomes a driver partner. Similarly, Urban Company has tied up with Skill India, right? So now we are practically training freshers for salon services, right? So these are the people who, imagine, they don't have any prior experience of let's say, providing salon services, but they will be trained extensively for months. So this is more like also an employment generation activity. And this is what typically a managed marketplace does, right? It solves for the customer experience at its core, and then develop everything around that, right? So the core of it is your experience. Everything around is your product, your training, your supply selection. Everything else is just revolves around the same thing.
From your experience, if you could share some of the examples of some of the strategies, right, that looked a little different at the beginning, right, unconventional, and worked pretty well, and what were the factors that contributed to it? And also on the flip side, initially some of these strategies that look good but sort of didn't work as expected, right? And what were the mistakes that happened in those? So if you could share some of the examples.
I think quite a few examples on both sides. I would say there would be more examples of strategies that didn't work, right? More than the ones that worked. And typically you just, 1 out of 10 strategies, even if they work, can actually give you a lot of leverage. And that's the important part, right? I mean, that sort of, and it's a lot more dependent on how individual company operates and their DNA, in which you can actually experiment and try it a lot, right? So, and again, I've been fortunate enough to do that. One of the strategies that was primarily on the supply growth side worked for us, and something that initiated in Delhi only, but that got replicated across India, was, so again, if you look at it, there's a common theme with all of these strategies that you create, right? It essentially, again, at the very heart of it is a very fundamental problem that you're solving, but if you do it right, then actually can give you a lot of leverage at scale. So very basic problem, we are in Delhi, in Ola, we're growing at a steady rate, but we realize there is a huge market out there. Now how do we solve for it? We realize that demand is not a problem. We are able to the demand is able to catch up supply pretty fast, because your product is so strong, and the problem that you're solving for a consumer is so basic that I want, let's say, a car at my fingertips within 5 minutes, right? That you really don't, and we, to be honest, didn't have to do a lot of marketing around it, right? What we had to solve for was the growing supply rapidly, right? And you do it even faster, and you're even more paranoid and even more nervous when you have a very strong competition along with you, right? So that also is a very strong trigger point. So one thing which we realize and solve for is that Delhi NCR is a huge geography, right? There are a lot of vehicles spread across the entire nooks and corners of NCR. We had one very small office where we used to call all of these vehicles, and it was a 1 day long, you can say, nightmare for, let's say, a driver to come to office, submit his document, go through a training, get his car audited, and then get attached to us, right? And in this whole time, right, and I'm talking about 2014, when even the drivers were not even confident of this, how much business can they make by doing this, because it was a completely new thing for them, right? They were used to somebody calling them. Most of them were working outstation, going to, let's say, Delhi, Jaipur, or Delhi, Uttarakhand kind of a thing, right? Haven't really worked on, let's say, where you get a booking from an app in 5 minutes, you pick the customer, drop them, etc. So we knew that there's a huge barrier that we had to solve for. And one strategy that we deployed was that we completely dismantled our existing onboarding model, which was typically more on a lead generation basis. So it's like somebody, a driver partner, refers his friend, right, who wants to get his vehicle attached, right? Then he will call in a call center, then they will call him to office, then he will spend his entire day to get attached, right? We're like, this is not making sense. This is slowing the growth down, right? And what we completely flipped was we created this entire field force team, right? Scaled it up to 60-70 odd people in the geography, and we send them to vehicles, right? So, you can see Ola employees in the middle of the night talking to a cab driver who's standing outside a call center, giving him training on the spot, right? So these people were trained, their vehicles were audited, their documents were scanned, uploaded, and within 2 hours, the thing that used to take 8 to 10 hours got reduced to 2 days, right? And this team, from, let's say, I think 20-30 odd vehicles that we were onboarding a day, moved to 180 to 200 vehicles a day, right? And that growth also was limited by the number of people that we were hiring, right? So if I would have doubled my team, then I would have acquired the supply at half the time, right, at which I was doing it. So that was one thing that worked. So again, very, very basic fundamental problem, right? What we started out to solve was that a person cannot come to my office and spend his entire day, right? It was just not happening, right? So we started from that, and we created a completely new onboarding model, which really scaled up the supply rapidly. Another example here is something now we are trying to do. I've been doing it for last 4 to 5 months for our business at Urban Company. Again, a simple strategy that a lot of people, because it's a service which is discretionary, right? It's more like an indulgence. People don't really think that they would probably would want to regularly take a massage, etc., right? And they have not been exposed to these services even in the offline world. Most of the people have not even tried it out, right? So what we typically realize and do is that a lot of people come onto the app and they just drop off, right? Because either they are confused, wherein they don't know what they're looking for. B, they don't find it relevant there. They're like, maybe it's just too expensive, or I don't think, why should I book it, etc., right? And hence, they just drop off, right? Now the problem here again for us to not solve is getting traffic or getting these people to open up the app, right? They already exist. The problem for us to solve is that they're not transacting with us, right? So again, there could be a lot of incremental small things that you could do and we have been doing in the past. But we again realize that the strategy is again to completely change and going from the incrementality to something radical, and which is why we're trying to put up, let's say, a sort of an automatic consultation or sort of a help bot, etc. that would happen, that would guide people to figure out what the right therapies, etc. would be for them to do. That's one. And secondly, expanding the range of services very widely, right? So right now, where you have, let's say, 4 or 5 SKUs that you can pick and choose from in the spa massage services, but then we rapidly expanded to 18, 20 of right. So that's how you start off with, and this is something when we are piloting it. A lot of these things you start off as an experiment because there's a lot of investment that is required, and you don't go all in all of these things, right? So you start off with small experiments, run these experiments very tightly, right? Figure out what is the incrementality that you established, and then build a conviction whether you want to scale or not, right? So we spend this time to build this conviction, and now we are scaling it up, right? This is again a step change. So these are sort of strategies that have worked. In terms of strategies that did not work for us, have been quite a few as well, right? One of the things was, maybe this is an example from Travel Triangle, where in domestic, again, we were not catering to certain geographies, right? And that has been the legacy, right? I mean, for example, the likes of Lakshadweep or some places in a smaller 2 to 3 day trips and tours in central India, etc. We were not catering to historically, right? Now, I came in and I thought that, okay, maybe let's just change it and completely modify, and maybe we can grow a lot, because you figure out there's a huge potential out there, nobody else is doing it, right? And you, being a marketplace, can scale up or do that quite easily, right? So we did that, build up supply, for example, figuring out how do you put that across on your website app, how do you promote it a bit, see if people can go to these destinations, right? But that strategy didn't work for us, right? We didn't actually get a lot of demand, because the thing is that we were looking for instant returns, right? We were looking for, let's say, if I put a new destination up today, people will start coming onto it from tomorrow, right? Now that doesn't happen, because these places have been so offbeat and locked for a while that the kind of consumers that you get onto this platform to book are not the ones who are exploring, right? They're the ones who are very fixed in where they want to go, right? So what happens is that you spend resources, money, time, everything in building that, setting that up, but once you do it, you realize that you're not able to identify the fundamental gap that exists, right? And the gap is the information gap of people trying to explore these destinations rather than solving for supply, right? So the difference between a success and a failure has been the same thing, that you've been able to identify that gap or the problem that exists very sharply and have been able to solve it in the right direction, versus either you could not identify the problem or you were not able to put the right solutions behind it.
So he wants to ask, would you say the managed marketplaces have managed to grow the category beyond the usual or expected year-on-year growth, or have managed marketplaces taken a share of the larger pie?
I think it's a combination of things. Two things. One is, how do we define what the market is, right? And varies differently for different categories, right? So some of the markets already exist, and where managed marketplace or urban company has taken a pie of it, right? Again, for example, let's say taking a salon service, right? Now, women's salon service, it's nothing that we have added which has not been there so far, and hence a market creation thing, right? Most of the things already exist, right? For a women's haircut, facial, waxing, etc. They typically get it done in an offline salon, right? So you just bring it at home. Now, in that case, you have actually taken that pie from the existing market, and of course, if you're not growing faster than how the market is growing, then practically doesn't make sense for you to be in the business. So that has not been the question at all, right? I mean, the way one company has grown has far exceeded the way market has grown. So typically that case you end up taking a share of the pie. Some of the categories have been practically non-existent or have existed at a very small scale, right? And it defines that when the consumers or the customers you acquire, were they using something similar before this, right? So the categories that have stood out in this typically have been, let's say, for example, professional cleaning services, right? Nobody used to get a regular cleaning of their bathroom or kitchen done from an expert, right? Either it was your maid who used to get it done, right? So these are services that have been added now and have become industry. Spa and massage service is also an example, right? 80% of our users are the ones who have never been exposed to let's say a professional massage therapy ever in their lives, right? So what it happens is that, let's say, for example, your existing market can be defined as let's say 10 million people in India taking 2 services in a year, multiplied by what is the average amount that you pay for a service as the market, right? Now here it is where there are 80% of the people who are taking these services for the first time, right? So this is something which basically expands the market, right? So it's dependent on the category, right? Whether it's a category creation or has been, a category that has created a whole new market or business for us, versus something that already existed before we just have, made it either more convenient or made it more trustworthy or made it, let's say, cheaper in some cases, right? So that's how it is. For example, again, AC servicing, right? Already existed. We are not creating something new, right? We might want to increase the incidences of AC servicing, right? Earlier, people used to get it once in 2 years. Maybe now you get it once in every 1 year, right? So you increase the incident, but you're not creating a new market, right? It's not that you've created, people didn't used to get their AC service at all, and now with urban company they're getting it done for the first time. That's not the case, right? They've been doing it traditionally as well. So yeah, I think it's a lot more category specific point.
So I wanted to know, how do you go about developing consistent feedback loops into your product?
You reach out to your customers, right? And you ask a very simple question to them. You ask, tomorrow if this product or tomorrow, for example, let's say urban company stops to exist, right? How disappointed will you be, right? And you give them 3 options, right? A, I'll be very disappointed. I will be somewhat disappointed. And third would be, I will not be disappointed, right? And if you have, more than 45% of the people say that they will be disappointed, right? Then, that basically determines that, what you have on your app right now makes a lot of sense, right? So which means that you don't have to fundamentally change which is there, right? If this number would have been, let's say 80% people would have said that, I won't be disappointed, right? So, it becomes, let's say, a question of your fundamental product market fit, as well as, the kind of offerings that you're providing, right? And hence their feedback loop becomes even more important, right? Now, this can happen at any scale, right? This can happen when you are at a small scale. This can happen at a large scale as well. So that is always one thing, which you keep on asking, over a period of time, and hence figure out that do you really have to take a step back and think about your offering, pricing, products, whichever it's available. The second thing in terms of, the way you put in feedback loops and, take action on is basically creating this bifurcation between, an anecdote versus something that is quantifiable difference or a survey, right? This was a famous quote from Jeff Bezos or I think it was him only said that, he'd go and believe in anecdotes more than, numbers that are being thrown, right? So it's like, if let's say even 2 or 3 customers come to me and say that, this is something which is not making sense, or, I'm not able to understand, or something is not right, etc., right? The way I do it is that take that very seriously and, look to figure it out, right? Now, there could always be contradictory views as well. Somebody will say, okay, this content that you have looks really good on the app. Somebody will say, no, it doesn't make sense, right? So you always, figure out what is the most optimal solution. You can't ignore, you can't ignore people who are, even if a single customer comes to me and say that this is something that you don't like, right? It has to be taken up. So that's how, the feedback loops are work, right? So there are some certain quantifiable general things which are already there, right? There is an NPS questionnaire, there is a post-service sort of, 3-4 questions that have been asked, right? You do take actions basis them. But I think that the richest information that you can get always is qualitative, and is something which you can always get when you, just speak to consumers, right? And take actions on them.
How we can actually reach to those audience who don't want to pay more than 250 rupees for their haircut, the same quality of haircut. So how urban company actually is planning to target those audience?
So there are 2 parts to it, right? One is probably asking or challenging the fundamentals of pricing, right? What I mean is, let's say, for example, you paid 500 rupees for a haircut, right? By the way, that's on the higher side. I don't know if you just took a haircut or something else, it should be somewhere around 300. So, but even with that number, people of course pay half of that in the offline market, right? Now there are 2 ways to answer this. One is, what is the right pricing, right? So let's say if offline is 150, that's an average, right? I mean, you break it down. These are not, services which are equivalent to a product. Let's say or maybe you can draw this analogy, right? That, for example, you get a toothpaste of 20 rupees as well, right? You can get a toothpaste for $200 as well. Right? So why would somebody pay, 200 rupees for a toothpaste if they can pay 20? So there could be a fundamental difference in terms of offering. That's one, right? Second is that not every service or a product is for everyone, right? That's the second point that's critical. And third is, what is the right pricing, right? And how do you determine that? The way we look at it is that, it's not a function of, for example, what is the price that people are paying or have traditionally been paying for the service, right? I mean, you give an example of 250 rupees for a haircut. let me tell you, this is our internal study, even there are less than 30% of the population that pays more than 200 rupees for a haircut, right? So even if 250 is the benchmark, we are still on the higher side, right? Even if it is 200, we are still on the higher side, right? So you can't continue dropping your prices because ultimately then you have to sell a haircut at $50, right? It doesn't make sense for us.
Suhail, I have a question here. What percentage of population are willing to pay above 1,500 rupees for a haircut? Have you had that anecdotal evidence also?
1,500 for a man, I would say it won't be even 0.1%. I mean, men are the most miserly, we call them chindis, right? I mean, don't want to spend anything on their personal grooming, right? That has been a, we are easily able to sell 1,500 rupees haircut for a woman, right? But for guys, no. And that's where, the second point of what I'm trying to say is not that they can't pay, right? It doesn't actually is a function of their spending power. It's that, they don't attach value to it, right? For a guy, for example, 100 rupees haircut would be as good as somebody paying, going to a Truefit and Hill or a Tony and a guy and paying, let's say, $700-800, right, for a haircut, right? Both will typically end up having the same result, right? The hair will look the same. It's the value that you attach to it, and that's the beauty of marketing that you do, right? It's like, how can you sell something? There are some functional benefits that you provide. Are people willing to pay for, let's say, at-home convenience, etc., or is there is something fundamentally different that you can also offer to them, right? So, and that what typically happens, right? So, it's a very pertinent question, Saif, because while you typically end up getting primarily those people who are paying the similar amount in an offline salon and who pay to you, these are your early adopters, right? But you also saw a lot of people coming in during the COVID times, right? And I mean, COVID has been this category has exploded, in the last 2 waves. We've grown 50% month on month. Because why, right? Practically people did not have alternate options, right? Offline salons were either shut or they did not find them safe, and hence all of them wanted to get a haircut from Urban Company, right? So right? It's not that again they would have still not gotten a haircut, right? They were like, it's 300 rupees, 400 rupees. Why should I pay, right? Let me grow my hair, right? But that's the need state that you captured, right? You figured out that if, let's say, COVID is one big lever that grew the business, what is the alternative to COVID, for example, right? So, that's how it is, right? We obviously can't take a call in terms of reducing pricing all the time. You have to basically figure out what is that price value equation that you have to solve for.
You talked about power users being there in your app, right? How do you drive these power users to then say eventually become product evangelists?
So to be very honest and frank with you, we I think if I talk about Urban Company and even Ola for that matter, we're not there yet, right? I wouldn't say that our users are product evangelists, right? There would be this set of 8 to 10% of our top users who still love the product, right? They probably will not live without it, right? Practically, a lot of them have been these working professionals like you and me, right? In the age of 25, 45, going to larger cities. They don't have the contacts and access, which let's say probably, they used to have in their hometown, or their father used to have it, right? If, for example, my dad won't call somebody from Urban Company to repair the television, right? He will have some numbers in his phone, right? He'll call them. Trust that guy, right? And you practically, when you're a young person or you move to a new city and you are more adept to using these tech platforms, then you get used to it, right? And then hence it becomes quite convenient, etc., for you to use them. So there are always this set of people who eventually will be your product evangelist. Reason will be for they always getting consistent good experience with you, both in terms of from the time of opening the app till the time of service getting executed, right? And even if there is one line that you can take away, I think it's been worth it. So yeah, all the best.